Chris at Mixpanel, who are kindly sponsoring tonight's virtual product tank. But for those of you who are actually joining us for the very first time, you're doing so under very special circumstances. But let me give you a bit of context about what Product Tank is about. This is something that started about 10 years ago when it was just in London, about 25 people in a basement, and we're now active in over 200 cities globally. And the concept, wherever you go, it's fair to say, is very much the same. It's by and for product people. It's an informal meetup, typically in person. It's about networking, it's about learning from each other, but there have been these kind of virtual versions as well. Apart from that, we have a very active community, lots of content. Again, you don't even need to leave the house and come to an event because we have lots of great stuff. We have our weekly newsletter. We've got mindtheproduct.com, where there's a lot of great content available to you. Before I tell you a bit more about the rest of the evening and what we're going to do next, I wanted to hand over to Chris from Mixpanel, who are kindly sponsoring tonight's Product Tank. So I wish I could ask you all to give a big hand to Chris, but hopefully you can do that virtually. Exactly, we all clap. Thank you so much. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Mark, appreciate it. Let me just quickly make sure I'm sharing my screen. And can everyone, I guess everyone can see my screen. Okay. So welcome. I suppose this may be the first virtual Product Tank, and as always, we're happy to be partnering with Product Tanks. As a quick introduction, as Mark just said, my name is Chris Smith. I'm a part of the account team here at Mixpanel based in London. So quickly, I'll introduce who we are, what we do, and then I'll pass on to the rest of the guest speakers later on. So Mixpanel, we've been around for a little over 10 years now, and we are a product analytics platform built by product people for product people. As I mentioned, we've been around for a little over 10 years, and we were built by two software engineering grads that were, I suppose, in this corporate world where they were working with these big old legacy traditional systems. They were gathering so much data from their customers, and they just weren't able to respond and innovate at the speed that the business demand. They were getting very simple questions, and it was taking either weeks or months to get that answer. And having things like session behaviors or page views is great, but what they actually wanted to understand is, what are our customers doing it? Why are our customers acting in a specific way? And what are they doing after? So they built this platform called Mixpanel that allows you to move away from page views and session behaviors more onto event driven. So we track every single action your customers make on online and offline. And if we look back over 10 years, we've changed away from the way of engaging with our customers. And myself being a buyer, from mobile to tablet to web, we now have iWatches, we now have IoT devices. As a customer, we're interacting with our brand and our organization multiple ways, and we need to track that complete end-to-end journey. So when you are a product manager or someone within the product team, you can then have an understanding of the impact that your features and product updates are having on the business, and understand and create hypotheses of, are my customers acting a specific way and as intended? If not, why not? So, and when you look at like the last 5 years, I think there's been 4 times the amount of unicorns in the last 5 years than there are in the last decade. And the reason because of that is because they're able to get answers to their product and being able to innovate a lot faster. What we're trying to do here at Mixpanel is solve this problem. Is 50% of product teams aren't confident in the tools that they have to get the right answers. So what we're trying to do at Mixpanel is enable everyone within the organization to be able to get answers very quickly and make more data-informed decisions. So what we want to do is look at things like funnels and flows, and look at the orchestration of your user journey, and look at the impact that is having on the business. So now you're enabling businesses and product teams specifically to have really complex answers answered within seconds. No longer are you needing to go to your blob storage or your data warehouse and then send it over to a BI team for them to come back, which could take weeks or months. the value that you're losing in that sort of aspect of that that time is actually tremendous in terms of what's happened to the business. So what we're trying to do is have right from your C-suite right down to your product teams, everyone within that sort of organization, to be able to have answers to your dedicated questions very, very easy. Not just talking about like how many page views have I had this week. That long gone are those days. Now we're going to get to really granular detail of looking at machine learning reports and different pre-built reports to look at what are your customers doing it, why are they behaving, looking at the hypotheses and looking at the trends of those data. And that's how Mixpanel was built. So we look at this innovation circle. So capturing that data, that isn't something groundbreaking, that isn't something traditional that Mixpanel has invented. We've been doing that for many years. What we have changed is how you identify those trends, looking at machine learning reports to look at like prediction and return and retention reports, allowing you to set our goals and hypotheses and making sure that your data and your customers are doing as intended, and then take action. That could be within Mixpanel, sending a push notification, an SMS, a web app or a webhook. That could be building better products, or that could be improving your marketing efficiency. And when you look at the customers like Uber and the Airbnbs and those sort of customers of Mixpanel, the reason why they're so successful is they can get around this cycle as quickly as possible. They're the reason why they become these unicorn companies out there that they can iterate, understand their customers, iterate and respond to as quickly as possible. Long gone of the legacy sort of like platforms that you have out there that it does take weeks or months just to make a simple change. These are just a couple of reports that you should be able to do within Mixpanel, looking at insights, common flows and funnel behavior, but also having a look at the machine learning reports like signal, predict and anomaly detection, all put into your dashboards, which can be viewed on the web or the mobile, as you can see there. And we just want to say thank you to ProductTank. They're enabling us to, one, build this community, allowing us to stay closer to that community. And that's why the whole reason why Mixpanel was built and crafted. Our founders and our C-suite are all product people and have a vision for being closer and tighter to the product. That's enough from me now. I don't want to be deaf by PowerPoint, but if you do want to reach out, please just go over to www.mixpanel.com or feel free to email myself, chris.smith@mixpanel.com. Please stay safe. I know what's going on in the world right now is quite a scary and dangerous place, but thank you all for taking some time just to have a 5-minute listen. And thank you again to ProductTank for creating this awesome community.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. I loved how there was someone already I saw on the Q&A feed who was physically clapping. I'm sure you'll get lots of claps. Thank you for that. Let me just make sure I can share my screen and do that properly. Just bear with me. Because what we'll do is different to normal is where we have a Q&A at the end. And normally we'd say, we sit on the stage and we'll take all your questions. Obviously, because we're doing this virtually, there's two options really for you to leave any questions or thoughts throughout. So you don't have to wait to the end. You can either leave a comment on YouTube. You can use Zoom where there's a Q&A feature, and some of you are already using that. If you have any specific questions, again, we'll be looking at those questions coming through, and then towards the end, we'll go through some of your questions that you've raised. And equally, you can, if you go on Twitter and you use the ProductTank hashtag, you can leave questions that way as well. So without further ado, let's get the party started, basically. We've got a great curator, Dave Martin. And again, thanks, Dave. This is a point where people can start clapping physically or virtually, because I know it's been, improvising and going with it. So thank you so much for curating tonight. And with that, I'll hand over to Dave Martin, your curator.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'll just share my screen as well. So if you could just stop for a second, that'd be wonderful. That's great. Thank you. It's a huge shame that we're not in Conway Hall, obviously, but hats off to Mind the Product for not letting anything get in the way. And well done, everybody, for being so flexible. Hopefully you're all sitting comfortably, ideally with a glass of wine or a bottle of beer, whatever your chosen beverage is. My name is Dave Martin, in case you didn't catch it. I have a few decades of experience in product management, and I'm currently the founder of Right to Left, the training company. Tonight's topic is going to be all about product and enterprise. And we have three really big aims to help you tonight. We want to help reset any misconceptions people might have around product management in big companies. We want to change the perception so you have more empathy with large companies and how they work and how you might best fit in them to gain experience and growth. And then thirdly, we want to make sure we arm you with some pragmatic advice that can, if you are in a large company, that you can take away and use tomorrow to help you in your day job. So hopefully, the audience that we're after here is trying to help those people who might be planning their career, for which large corporations can provide some really crucial learnings and stepping stones. For those people that have potentially ruled out the evil corporate, maybe we can help change your mind. And then finally of all, we want to help those people who are already in large companies just to enjoy what they're already doing and do it better, help them be the best they can be. We've got some really amazing speakers tonight, so I've got to thank them all, and they've all been so flexible and handled the recent changes. We have Matt Stratford, Steve Pinches, and Pippa Top. I've personally worked with all of them. I'm pretty lucky to say that. And they have a real mix of experience. They've experience from C-suite, private equity, working with national utility firms, consulting, working with publishing businesses, global enterprises, with the BBC, with eBay, with Financial Times, and many more. So we've got really first-class speakers for you. Oh, I should have hit that button. Just before we kick straight off, I just wanted to let you know that my company, Right to Left, has just released a new assessment to help people plan their career and understand their strengths and weaknesses. So if that interests you, check it out. I'd appreciate it. It's at toolkit.righttoleft.co.uk. But right now, it's time to hand over to Matt, our first speaker. I'll just stop sharing screens, Matt, so that you can take over. Matt is a senior product manager at Mendeley, where he helps researchers build their knowledge for discovering breakthroughs. Pretty handy right now. His interests include politics. He's studying the recent general election. He's interested in sustainability and scholarly communication. So over to you, Matt. Matt, I think you're on mute.
I can't believe I just did that classic thing of speaking to myself while muted. So you can tell that this is the first time we've run a virtual product tank in as long as I've been going. So hopefully you can all hear me now. I'm hearing a loud virtual cheer. And I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for joining. Obviously, it would have been way better for us to be in Conway Hall, having a beer together, talking to each other, shooting the breeze, chatting the chat. But we're here, and I hope that you find this talk interesting and stimulating, and I think you will. So I want to talk about, are we the baddies? And by we, I mean people who work in large corporations. Now, there's a principle, do no harm, that's embedded deeply within medicine. It's a shame that it's not quite so deeply embedded within large companies, because large companies are evil, aren't they? After all, when Google got to be a properly large company, did it not drop "don't be evil" from its code of conduct? Who'd want to work for a large company like that? Well, I guess no one, to judge by the number of popular Medium posts on the topic. From this evidence, it looks as though almost everybody works for a startup. But when you come to think about it, it's obvious that not everybody must work for a large startup. Large companies must have a lot of employees. At least as many of us will work for large companies as do for small companies, right? Maybe the guys on the right are just too busy to be writing Medium posts. Personally, I have no problem at all working for a large company. I guess this is in some part because I've got a big ego, but as I see it, large companies are, well, large, and so they have a lot of power and they have potentially great influence. And large companies really provide the fabric of everyday modern life, even if we don't usually make that connection. Large companies are responsible for advances that would have seemed impossible even a generation ago. If any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, it's mostly large companies that are doing it. The more you think about it, the more you'll be struck by how embedded large companies are in everything. And I think you should appreciate that society has really been enhanced by them. Large companies connect the world with railways, phone masts, aeroplanes, transatlantic cables, electricity. Large companies develop medicines that treat the sick. They develop vaccines that eliminate disease, and let's hope they get to a new vaccine soon. They create marketplaces that sustain jobs and platforms that sustain entrepreneurs. Communities, nations, whole regions are to large part defined by the success of their large companies. You could even go so far as to say that much of modern product management is made possible because of the existence of large companies. When you look at the data, the world is in many respects getting better. In many measures of human well-being, from life expectancy through to the elimination of poverty, you can see in the data, you look at the data, things are improving. So since improvements in modern life and large companies are so intertwined, maybe large companies deserve more of the credit. Today, there's an unprecedented lockdown owing to the you-know-what, and everybody's brain is a bit scrambled right now. But if you look at it from a long historical perspective, this is peak civilization. I really mean that. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, have you seen the news? And yeah. But I wonder, maybe what we're seeing is actually an unprecedentedly effective response to the kind of plagues that have historically killed millions of people. Spanish flu in 1918 killed 50 million people. And coronavirus deaths in China number under 2,000, and infection rates are now falling. I guess we'll see. Still, we don't live in paradise. Large companies have a dark side, and it is dark. The factory farming to get meat to the table for less than the price of a cup of tea. The depletion of natural habitats and draining of aquifers to get imported bottled water to stores. The 0-hour contracts, which transfer risk from large companies to the precarious and to the poor. In 2018, the UK construction and facilities giant Curation went into liquidation. And on the surface, it was escalating debts that did it in. But a parliamentary investigation found that senior executives had prioritized their own bonus payments and dividends for shareholders above keeping the company solvent, while the employee pension contributions were skipped altogether. The company's failure left UK taxpayers picking up $1 billion in pension liabilities. That's you and me, for those of you working in the UK. In short, Curash's bosses drank champagne and left us to pick up the tab. In September 2015, the US Environmental Protection Agency announced that it believed Volkswagen had been cheating emissions tests. Its diesel vehicles were found to emit up to 40 times the amount of nitrous oxide measured in standard tests. Nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas. It creates city smog. It contributes directly to serious respiratory conditions, such as asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema. It's not hard to conclude that Volkswagen endangered public health to meet its dividend target. The Rana Plaza factory building near Dhaka, Bangladesh, employed low-paid women to produce cheap apparel for Western retailers like JCPenney, Zara, and Primark. There were many complaints about the factory building's integrity, but if you need work and you don't have alternatives for income, then it tends to keep you quiet. And so the complaints were brushed off and business as usual continued. And on the 24th of April, 2013, it collapsed. 1,134 people died. Mothers, sisters, daughters, dead. And it's not fanciful to conclude that Western retailers turned a blind eye to their supply chain so that consumers can buy t-shirts for less than a fiver. Now, I work for a large company. Many of us here do. And I think it's incumbent upon us to think about what working for large companies means. Are we guilty by association? Well, most people find that premise very challenging. Employees working at large companies are largely decent people trying to do a decent job. But if that's so, how does this kind of thing arise? This bad behavior? Is it just bad apples? It's an appealing explanation, but I don't think that's all there is to it. Let me tell you a story. My dad is a great guy. You'll have to take my word for it. And he worked for a big specialist insurance firm whose name you will know. And he once told me about a project he worked on around transfer pricing. Now, transfer pricing is the idea that a company can make a lot of profit in one jurisdiction that has a high tax rate, but funnel that profit into another jurisdiction that has a low tax rate, and do this all within the same company. I won't go into the technical details of this arrangement. Suffice to say, it is perfectly legal. And it's why, for example, all of your invoices from Amazon are billed to Luxembourg, and all of your invoices from Apple come through Ireland. The context of this project was that the company was getting near to the end of a period of a special tax break given to it by the UK government. And under pressure to save millions off the budget, the company scouted around for the next base they could get a tax break from. And in this case, it ended up being Singapore. And Dad, as a trained accountant and experienced IT project manager, worked with others to restructure the business so that as little on the ground changed as possible, but the profits were rerouted to minimize tax exposure. This is not exceptional. A big chunk of the City of London is built on this kind of work, and a big part of the UK's tax base comes from those firms. But my dad's company saved millions of pounds in tax that could have been spent on good causes and raised its profit as a direct result of his team's work. On one level, that sounds like a great success. But on another level, it sounds like a scandal. Large companies today are global, internationally nimble, and they have a legal duty to maximize returns to shareholders. So is this just doing what they are set up to do really, really well? What's success here? Whose fault is it, if fault is to be apportioned? I mean, just to confirm, my dad is not a bad guy, okay? Giant insurance companies are staffed by these decent people trying to do their decent job. Maybe whose fault is the wrong kind of question. We reach for people to blame when maybe there are deeper structural issues that need to be given more weight. I'm going to talk to you about Rory Stewart. This, by the way, is the best Rory Stewart drawing I could do. Rory Stewart was a Conservative MP for 9 years and a government minister, and now he's running for Mayor of London. Leading up to the December 2019 election, he was asked, "What was your proudest moment while you're in government?" And he thought about it for a bit and replied, Well, signing the plastic bag tax into law. That's pretty cool. But he went on to say, the things you do as a minister seem big, but what you're actually doing is signing a piece of paper. You're not really the person implementing, and of course, you're aware that 7 years of policy preceded you. If I hadn't signed it, someone else would have. If I hadn't signed it, someone else would have. I can't quite communicate to you how much this system is bizarre and how much you are being lied to, because MPs don't want to tell you how powerless they are. This is the UK Parliament he's talking about. And I've stood to become an MP. It is stressful, hard work. The only reason you go into it is because you think you can make a difference. And I can tell you, candidly, I get paid more than an MP does. So the type of people who become MPs are one of either two things: exceptionally public-spirited or exceptionally Machiavellian. And I genuinely believe, although there will be skeptics around, that the former outweigh the latter. And what this shows for me, this story, is that, yeah, MPs feel powerless to do things. They want to improve things, but sometimes they end up doing bad things without intention. They do things that the system compels them to do. So maybe we've got to get beyond individuals in explaining how things happen. I want to make it a little bit personal here for you. What is your job? This is a product manager meetup. What is your role in your company as a product manager? Now, I remember an early product coach of mine saying, and this really stuck in my head, when you boil it right down, it's a numbers game. You're there to make the numbers grow. Not only you, also me. And just think, in a large company, what would you not do to make the numbers grow? I'm sure that, like me, you will have your own personal moral code. You might even quit if the situation was sufficiently bad and you were being asked to do something terrible. But the truth is, you quitting might not matter that much. Of course, it would matter to you a lot, but maybe it doesn't matter so much at scale because you're replaceable. Product management, you can hire a new product manager and put a product manager into a product manager role. You'll get different results, but not radically change different results. An individual's behavior doesn't often change the overall behavior and logic of the situation and the company. Everyone listening who works at a large company, consider this. How much employee churn have you had? And how many of those churning employees have really, really made a difference, coming in or going out? Probably very few. What's much more common is that the employees change, but the company does not change. The goals of the company don't change. The way of doing things in the company don't change. The emerging resulting behavior doesn't really change. And this is how large companies outlast human lifespans. And the ironic thing is, this is how large companies like it. If you take an MBA, one of the things they will tell you is how to keep the organization going. If you're a successful company with a dominant position, then it's about using your resources to maintain your success. It's success to the successful. Keep the boat from rocking. You'll usually find this framed as something like the core competence of the company that endures. So let's consider large companies as systems. Every system has elements, interconnections, and a function. The goal of any large publicly listed company is to grow up and to the right. Maybe it's that way on YouTube. And when push comes to shove, a large company exists to grow profit. And that comes ahead of every other consideration. The brutal arithmetic of the P&L is raise revenue, cut costs. And when you frame it like that, you can kind of see how in some competitive industry contexts, Maybe everyone's standards are slipping a bit. Maybe regulators can't quite see what you're doing enough. But a situation emerges where not taking advantage of dodgy loopholes like transfer pricing could mean going out of business and putting people out of work. As a C-suite executive, would you want that on you? So are we the baddies? Well, no, but it's the wrong question. Asking, are we the baddies, turns systemic, emergent corporate behavior into matters of individual morality. And it's usually not about individuals. Most people are reasonable, and every reasonable person would want to stop a large company doing something bad if they could, all else being equal. So the better question is, how do we do better? How can you structure a company to avoid putting individuals into a situation where they might do something bad to meet your company goal? And that, I'm pleased to say, is something we can look at with a grain of hope. Because to a certain extent, it's absolutely possible to make good interventions in the system. I said that changing individual elements in the system doesn't often make a difference, and that's true. But that doesn't mean that an individual can't make a big difference to the system if it's the right individual and the right intervention. Football managers are a great example. Occasionally, you'll get a Klopp or a Wenger, and a revolution really does happen. With the right levers, you can make a difference not only to the large company, but outside of it as well, to the industry and to society at large. And this is why Clay Christensen says, management is the most noble of professions if it's practiced well. The key to making changes in a complex system in a large company is to make interventions with very high leverage. The right person can change the way that a large company conceives of its goals. The right person can make changes to get the right information to people in a visceral way, so that where they didn't have information to make a good decision before and might accidentally make a bad decision, they can make a much better one. The right person can develop the company's ability to self-organize in response to change and do better in morally hazardous situations. This kind of high leverage intervention has within it the possibility to change a large company in deep structural ways. The bad news is these leverage points are usually very non-obvious. But the good news is, if you can find them, there is no better way of increasing your value to your company and making a massive impact in the world. So in the end, are we the baddies? No, it's the wrong question. It isn't about goodies and baddies. People generally do the things that their role in the system compels them to do. Sometimes the situation arises that they feel they have no other choice but to do something they feel a bit uncomfortable with. And that's not usually a bad egg ordering them, although it can happen that way. It's more usual that the situation where doing bad becomes close to inevitable arises out of complex, emergent interactions within and outside the company that no single individual intends. Situations have more effect than disposition on what happens. We know that. To blame people is the fundamental attribution error. So if you want your large company to do less evil, you've got to put your system thinking hat on and start searching for the leverage to change it. That's all from me.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thank you ever so much. And we'll change speakers now to Steve. If you can share your screen, Steve. Steve is Chief Operating Officer for TES Global, a private equity-backed education business. He's previously led product at both Pearson English and at the Financial Times. He loves building products and businesses which help teachers and schools to succeed. So it's over to you now.
Thanks, Dave. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great.
Fantastic. Well, I just wanted to say thanks to Matt first for that presentation. It was really really interesting, and kind of there's some weird. I hadn't actually seen Matt's presentation before. There's some really weird links with mine, and just wanted to start with a little personal story, which was about my sister. So my sister, I've always worked for companies that I guess I've always thought of as being kind of morally acceptable, if that makes sense. So I've always worked for, the Financial Times was a really great media brand that I really believed in and felt passionate about. Pearson, had a strong mission in education, and now TES, who also do. My sister, who is the most wonderful person you'll ever meet in your life, the most fantastic, morally upright person you'd ever meet, has worked for a nuclear weapons company. She's worked for a mining company, and she's worked for a cosmetics company. And I know that she, the way that she approached all of those was that she could make a real difference in those businesses, and she did, because of her personal moral integrity and what she brought to those companies. So I think a big part of it is, that can individuals change companies? I think they absolutely can, and I think they can also change the lives of the people in those companies if they're the right person. So slightly off topic, but it just really made me think of that. So anyway, I'm going to talk about something slightly different. I'm going to talk a little bit about ownership and about acquisition within companies. So I'm very fortunate within TES to have a great product team who I work with, some of whom are on the call today, and they do some amazing work with schools. A lot of them have been working over the last few days, really supporting schools through what's happening with coronavirus at the moment, coming up with product innovations very quickly that can help with home learning and things like that. We've got some mentoring work going on with schools at the moment where we're matching digital mentors. We've got all sorts of other things going on. So very lucky to have a team that can turn those things around so quickly and be so responsive. So I'm just going to move on. Hopefully you can see my screen. So I wanted to start by talking about ownership. And I think what I wanted to say is that it really doesn't matter who owns your company, whether it's a VC company, whether it's a private equity company, or it's a it's a listed company of some kind, or a not-for-profit. You can't succeed in anything that you do unless you're solving some problems for customers. And I hope that doesn't really need saying, but it underpins everything that I'm about to say. If you're not solving a problem, then you might as well not be here. But there are some differences, and I'm sure there are people on the call who come from lots of different backgrounds. I'm going to make loads of generalizations here, so there might maybe people who are a bit like, well, that wasn't my experience, but this is kind of just trying to think a little bit through it. So I've worked, as I said, for big private publicly owned companies. Currently at TES, we're somewhere in the middle. We're a private equity business. We're owned. We've got about 500 staff. We're pretty big in terms of what we do, working with schools. But the way that it works quite often with a private equity owned business is that you're on a cycle, which is slightly different from a public business. And normally that cycle is about 3 to 4 years. So each 3 to 4 years, there'll be a new owner that comes into the business and have their own thoughts about what the business should be doing and how it should expand and how they can transform it in some way. So there's this constant process of renewal every 4 years. And I came in just before, the last but one owners, and their first hypothesis was really about going and growing digital recruitment, advertising, and content revenues. And there's a real push for those 4 years about transforming the business and growing, some of those digital revenue streams in the business. And then what happens is, at the end of that cycle, you get an owner and things change extremely fast. And you've got a second owner who comes along. And, our previous owner, there was a big focus on the US. They were an American-based company. And it was about how we could build a marketplace where people could share resources with each other. And that is something that happens very, very quickly. And, there's a big and sudden change to the organization. And then we get another owner who's recently taken over in the last sort of 18 months. And again, the hypothesis completely changes. So, the new hypothesis with the new owners is very much about going after international schools, understanding how we can support international schools as well as those in the UK. And also, how can we make sure that with a big sales team that we have, we can offer more products to more schools and really solve more problems for schools in the right areas. So it's a bit more of a kind of step change than you get in a lot of other businesses. And certainly when I worked at the FT and in other businesses, there was that feeling that yes, you could do things quickly. There's always ways to do things quickly within businesses, but if you really want to make substantive change, it is a bit like an oil tanker turning around in the sea. This is the biggest ship in the world. It takes 5 miles to turn around. And sometimes it felt a little bit like that. You could get product out very quickly, but really to change business models, to change all the operational backing of a business, that took a long time to do. With a private equity business, with also, I guess, with VC businesses, VC-backed businesses as well, you have to turn very, very quickly. And that really is absolutely crucial. And there's also, if you zoom in on that 4-year window, there's a real cadence to how a business like TES works. And this is similar for a lot of businesses. So you have a first year where, you have a new owner. They have a very clear idea of what they want you to do, and you have to act very quickly. And often there's a big investment at the beginning of the cycle where suddenly there's an injection of capital into the business. The first thing you need to do very quickly when that happens is you need to make sure you're clear about the goals, the investment strategy, what the plan is for the next 4 years, and then work out your operational plan on how you're going to deal with that. And that's what we've been doing, as you go through that process. It's very important that you get the boots on the ground as early as possible. And this is one of the things that I found very different to businesses I've worked in the past. The speed at which you're expected to get people on the ground, and that might be product folk, it might be sales, is extremely fast, and you grow the business very quickly. For us, in the current cycle that we're in, that was mainly about getting sales teams out. And we massively expanded our international sales team that's going out to international schools. We opened offices in Hong Kong, in Kuala Lumpur. We expanded our office in Dubai. We got colleagues working in other territories as well, very, very quickly. I mean, when I say quickly, I mean within a matter of a few weeks. The other thing is, this is an image from when I worked at the FT, but this is the time within the cycle when typically you're really in that acquisition area. So there'll also potentially be some disposals from the last cycle. So there may be things that are no longer in line with what you're trying to do. And then also a big growth. So we have a great team at TES who have been looking for businesses that align with our values and with what we're trying to do for schools, and are talking to those businesses. And that process, involves a lot of product thinking. You have to really think about, areas that you could expand into, and really think about whether or not it's better to try and build something or to acquire. And it's a difficult challenge for private equity firms, because quite often, really their first jump will be to acquisition, because they're only in the business for 4 years. They're looking for a business. They're looking for you to expand into areas where there's already some growth, so you can build on that growth, rather than having to start from scratch. And obviously, there's a higher risk of failure rather than finding something which is already working in a particular market. And I think this period is a really crucial period from a product perspective, because there's a massive gap between what looks good on a PowerPoint slide in in the boardroom of a private equity firm, and the reality of creating a bunch of things that hang together in a way which is really going to solve problems for users and is going to feel coherent. The other danger of this is that depending on the area you're looking at, and especially at the moment with the dearth of investment opportunities, there is a danger that companies get lured outside of their sort of core competencies, their core areas, and once they start casting around, they find businesses with sort of adjacencies that seem kind of relevant, but they're not. So it's really important for the product teams to get involved and really question and ask whether or not the businesses that we're looking at are really genuinely aligned. That's a product challenge. It's also a technology challenge. So it's quite easy to find a business which does something similar, but maybe their stack is in a totally different language, and they've got a completely different hosting infrastructure. And actually, to put those things together you'd end up with some kind of horrible Frankenstein monster. So it's really crucial phase for some good product thinking and some due diligence around the product at that point. And the other thing, and this is the thing that kind of gets neglected a lot, not just in PE-backed businesses, but also in large, enterprises as well, large sort of public companies, is the chassis. So as you're acquiring those businesses, it becomes more and more important that key parts of your business, key enabling parts of your business, are actually modular enough that you can work and you can slot them into the businesses that you're acquiring. You need to have a single view of the customer. You need to have ways of being able to track customers as they move around. Invoicing, payments, all the stuff that can get left behind is so important, and it gets missed so many times, because once you get on that sort of hunt for acquisitions, this less sexy stuff can really get left behind. So you get a few acquisitions in, things are going well, you get into the cycle, you get to year 2, and really the next step is you've got your boots on the ground, you need to move them around, you need to start optimizing and thinking about whether you've got the right people in the right time. At this point, there's still potentially quite a lot of investment coming in to the business. That the PE firm are looking for growth. There may be things that aren't working. Those will get moved on very quickly, because you know, this is a test and learn phase for them as well, and they're in a luxury position quite often of being able to try some things out. You know, still probably looking at a few acquisitions, but also really evaluating whether or not what you bought is working. And importantly, the chassis is beginning to spread out so that you've enabled more and more of those businesses and put them onto the platform. And really, by the end of year 2 of an investment cycle, you should be in a position where those acquisitions are really humming. You know, the growth curve is going up nicely. All of the key metrics are moving in the right way. You've optimized those in the right way, and the sales teams, everybody else, are all operating in perfect harmony. Obviously that doesn't happen, but that's where you're trying to get to, and there'll always be bits of roughness around the edge, but that's absolutely what you're aiming for. That means that year 3 and year 4 really should be fairly straightforward. So year 3 should really be about tweaking and optimizing so that you can really consolidate the growth you've seen in the first 2 years. And then really year 4, as you're moving into the exit, and this, you know, this is a very, very kind of stripped down version. Sometimes this could be 7 years, it could be 3, but generally, you know, you're aiming at about 4. By year 4, you're really thinking about how you know, what's the story about the business that you've created, how much have you transformed it, and what's the next, what's the next hypothesis for the business going to look like for the next 4 years. And you know, the astute amongst you will realize that this is very much like a product development cycle, test and learn cycle, but it's just on an epic scale. And you know, a lot of the product thinking I think could really apply to the private equity world, and it probably hasn't actually filtered into PE enough. So personal experience, we've been on the acquisition trail. A lot of these businesses here weren't part of TES, or weren't significantly part of TES, you know, even 6 months ago. We've got more that we're buying, but we've basically brought up a selection of businesses that really complement what we do. And what's great is they also have a really shared sense of values in terms of what we do. They really believe in the power of great teaching and how we can support schools and all the things that are really important to everyone who works at TES. And a huge cultural fit, and I'm sure the people on the call from TES would agree with that. But you have to think on 2 axes when you're thinking about how these businesses grow. First axis is really, you have to win in each vertical. So you have to be you know, we bought a safeguarding training company called Educare, which is the second one you see here. They have to be the best safeguarding business. They have to be absolutely something that would be able to stand alone and can compete with their colleagues. And there's a danger, and I've seen this in bigger companies I've worked with, that you get so obsessed with integration that you lose that focus on the fact that you have to win in the vertical that you're in. And that is so crucial. And it's the same for all of these. And obviously these all are working in tandem in different regions, different areas. And then really, as I put on the bottom here, it's about understanding what is the glue that binds. How do you make these businesses become more than the sum of the parts? And that requires really, really careful prioritization, but it also requires discipline in understanding that you don't, you know, this isn't just about polishing the surface of all of these businesses so they look like they're integrated. You have to do the heavy lifting underneath as well. And you really need to think about how these businesses are actually connected underneath the surface. So what does that mean in practice? Well, this is my car. I am a very, very exciting middle-aged man. I drive a Skoda, a 3-year-old Skoda. Here it is in the garage in Harlow, because that's the kind of exciting place that I spend my weekends. And for those of you who know anything about companies, and it's funny that we kind of made the connection with Volkswagen. This is not my car, but it kind of is, because underneath this is something called, I believe, and the car geeks amongst you might disagree, something called the MQB platform, which is the chassis and the underlying structure of the car. And they're essentially the same thing. So this makes me feel slightly better about driving around in my middle-aged family wagon. And for those who know Volkswagen Audi Group, basically that's how they build cars. They build a single platform and then they iterate on top of it. So actually the car might look very different, but underneath what's going on is very, very similar. There it is. That's what the chassis looks like, and that forms the basis of a lot of their cars. So I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, don't panic. But this is, I guess, when we think about product, and maybe I have a slight operational bias, but when we think about product, a lot of the product that we're building is actually the structure underneath, is the chassis. And here we have our process from when we talk to customers all the way through to when customers renew with us as existing customers. And you can see that we've built a standard set of capabilities using lots of different third-party platforms that we've stitched together. And that means that schools can have a consistent experience of us. We become an onboarding engine for software for schools. And as you can see, all the way through there, Salesforce is a backbone of that. But various other platforms that are all strung together to mean that there's a common experience, or there will be, as we pull this together, there will be a common experience for any customers who are coming on and they're going to adopt any of our acquisitions. And this is really crucial stuff. And if you don't do this and you don't focus on this stuff, you end up with a bunch of spaghetti, and you end up with acquisitions which are worth less than you pay for them. And you have to bear in mind there's some great stats from I think it's Deloitte or PwC that 80% of acquisitions in the enterprise fail. So your chances of success are very low, and we've certainly had our failures at TES, but we've also had our successes. So I think that a key part of the success is getting this chassis absolutely right. So what does that mean for product? This is really just to sum up. But the first thing, and again, echoing Matt's slides, which I hadn't seen, do no harm. We're obviously kind of in a bit of a medical mindset with everything going on with coronavirus, but we put this on the first page of the first slide when we talk to staff whenever we acquire a business. And I have to explain what that means in detail, because people can think that do no harm means do nothing. And it doesn't mean that, because we are there to add value to those businesses. What it means is that we treat the staff with respect, and there may be changes. There are often changes when there's an acquisition in terms of people leaving the business, people potentially their roles changing, all kinds of things which can be quite unsettling. We need to make sure that we do those things and we treat people with respect and we do things in the right way. So do no harm means treat people with respect, but it also means maintain the revenue and grow it by making the changes that are necessary. Don't do things unless you think that they're going to improve things. It's obvious, but it still happens. Second thing is, it's very tempting to create a layer over the top of all the acquisitions to make it feel like everything's humming away nicely and stitched together in the back end. And there are some really good options to do that. And I wouldn't say don't do that. It's a very good thing to do, and it can make things feel very coherent very quickly. But don't do that at the expense of the back end. You absolutely have to integrate what's going on in the back, and you have to invest and prioritize. One of the things I would really think about is, quite often it's easy to think about the back end stuff as operational, as something that the technology teams are doing. It's not part of the product workflow, and that happens a lot in bigger businesses. You really need to get the product thinking flowing in there. And I don't know if Ed is on the call, one of our product managers, but he's been working on a big back end project, but as a product manager, and thinking very much about what that means to our customers and to our internal users, and making sure that you have that product focus, even though it feels very infrastructure-y. The other thing is about culture. So this is easy to say, but harder to do. It's very, very, very important when you acquire a business to get cross-functional teams working quickly, to embed people in those businesses and to make it feel more like a merger as much as possible. So we have some great work going on at the moment to create a great training platform for schools. And we've brought people from Educare, one of the businesses we acquired, into that squad. They're all working in a cross-functional way, and that has had a much broader impact in terms of the teams between the two locations, really kind of gelling and working better together, and it's been very, very successful. So do that, and do something which I think probably I didn't do particularly well, and I'm trying to do more now, which is also to reset the product challenge with the existing teams within the core business, and try not to use the phrase core business if you can, because it's very important that those teams are on the journey with you, and they understand why. For example, as was the case with us, you've moved away from greenfield product development to more integration and more focus on how we can add value through acquisition and through integration of acquisition. And the other thing, again, which is very much work in progress for us, and something that really we've only started thinking solidly about for the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks, is the exit vision. So we need to think longer term about 2023 and set that guidance about where we want to be. And that's not just about metrics and high level strategy. I'm quite a visual person. I like to see things, and I think there's a lot to be said for creating, a set of visuals that kind of talk to what the website, what the product might look like in 2023. God knows what they genuinely look like. Things will be very, very different, but there's no harm in setting that visual kind of North Star in terms of where you're going and what you want. And we're in the process of doing that at the moment. Final kind of thought, I guess, from the famous Abraham Maslow. This is kind of something that struck me as important. Maslow said, I suppose it's tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And I think there's always a danger, and this happened a lot in bigger companies I've worked with, once you get into the integration mindset, to see synergies between businesses that don't exist. So yes, there are synergies between businesses we've bought, but inevitably, when you get people together in a room, they get very excited. They start talking about ways that you could work together, and you can go down a million blind alleys very, very quickly, trying to find ways that these acquisitions that you have fit together that are actually irrelevant. And I can't remember who it was. There's a famous phrase in product, which is the most dangerous phrase in product is, "Wouldn't it be great if?" And when you hear that, my ears always prick up a little bit, because it tends to be predicated with some kind of idea of how we could kind of shunt things together in a way which makes the sum greater than the parts. And you really have to check whether or not that's right, and think again about the customer and how you can test and validate or just dismiss ideas very quickly, so that you don't get distracted. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of my experiences of working in sort of small and medium-sized businesses, and trying to think about acquisition and how that affects the product development cycle. I hope that was helpful, but it's definitely been helpful for me just putting this deck together and thinking about the challenge in the round. So thanks to everyone for the opportunity.
Thanks ever so much, Steve. And it's been really interesting listening to both you and Matt. Plenty of information and thought there. Can we, just as a reminder, while Pippa shares her screen, just as a reminder to everyone, please do put questions you might have for everybody in the live chat window on YouTube, or in the chat window or Q&A window in Zoom. And then at the end of the last presentation, which Pippa will be taking on, we will be able to then share together and ask the questions to the speakers. Pippa, just so you know, we can see your speaker notes, not the slides. If you hit the little reverse button near the X, that will swap towards the right. I'll just introduce Pippa while she's fixing that. Pippa is a product leader with experience across multiple large enterprises, including BBC, Hive, eBay, and interestingly, where Steve is, at TES Global. She's currently the head of product at Comparison Technologies, and she's going to explain to us how to get shit done. Over to you.
Hi, can you see the right slides now?
It's all good and we can hear you brilliantly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dave. Hi, I'm Pippa. I'm going to talk to you about getting shit done in big corporations. The reason for this talk, when I started thinking about what I could share with you all, was because I really thought about when I started to get into product years ago. And I was Googling my way frantically through my imposter syndrome. And I'd come up with these amazing sort of Medium articles and product tools that all seem really, really relevant if you're in a startup. But the bit I kept saying to myself is, but how am I going to get shit done? Like, there's so much bureaucracy in these big organizations. It can really feel like you're wading through mud to get anything out there. So to start with, I'd like, oh, hang on a sec, there's something beeping at me. Right, can you see the next slide, or has the speaker notes come back up?
It's all great.
Great, okay, sorry, my computer's beeping at me, there we go. So to start with, I'd like you to just imagine you're going to a big event, driving to a big event. I had originally planned that we'd talk about Glastonbury Festival, but that might feel a bit raw for some people out there at the moment. But let's suspend reality for a sec. You're driving to Glastonbury Festival. You're on the motorway. It's really busy. Everyone's trying to get there. Someone cuts you up, or they do something stupid, or they drive right up behind you, and you might mutter something rather unpleasant about them, maybe make a little bit of a judgment about who they are as a person based on their driving ability. But that's fair enough. They're stupid, right? They're idiots. But now imagine you're driving in convoy and you want to keep close behind the person who you're following. You might drive a little bit too fast or not let someone else in. But it's okay, right? Because it's you and you know your context and your own motivations. Well, sometimes, the way I see it anyway, working in a big organization is kind of like this. You can look around and easily think everybody else is a moron because they're getting in the way of you getting what you need to get done. But actually, if you take a bit of time, you put a bit of context around things and throw in a bit of empathy and curiosity, you might be surprised at what you can achieve. So where have I worked that's considered a big corporation? I hadn't even really thought I did work at lots of big companies until I started putting this slide together. But I want to just talk through this, not so I can share with you my whole CV, but more that you can get an idea of some of the problems and complexities around big organizations. So I started out as a project administrator at the BBC. It was my first ever experience of working on a software project. And if you Google Digital Media Initiative, you'll find it is the most famous, most expensive failed waterfall project, I think, in the history of the world. It was £125 million spent on delivering absolutely nothing, but I learned some really valuable lessons there. I worked at Siemens as well, which you probably have heard of. Their IT business alone had 30,000 employees in it. From here, I went to British Gas, which is part of Centrica. British Gas has 15,000 engineers going into customers' homes every day and 2,000 contact center staff. So if you imagine if you're making any change to the business whatsoever and you have to consider these people, just training alone can take months to get it all round. From here, I went to work at Hive. So Hive is part of British Gas, but it's set up as sort of an enterprise-backed startup within the business. So startup in the sense it can move quite quickly to build and deploy things, but it is often held up by some of the bureaucracies of the bigger organization. I've also spent time in Gumtree, which is part of eBay Classifieds Group and eBay, which you may have also heard of. What was difficult here is between me and the CEO of eBay, there were 7 layers of management, all of whom had interests in the area I was in, which was on the job side of the Gumtree business. So if you think about getting through your levels of communication, it's quite a challenge in itself. But I've not always stayed at these big companies. I also spent time with Dave and Steve at TES, and I'm currently at another private equity-owned company, Comparison Technologies. I suppose the real point here is all the learnings I'm sharing with you are from a range of businesses, and really it kind of doesn't matter what size you're in. You can hopefully find something in this that you can apply tomorrow. Know your operation. So as product people, we're always wanting to be customer centric, and that's great. But without having a really good understanding of your operation, you're at risk of missing something. How often do you find yourself in conversation with people where someone says, oh, the business won't do that, and the business want this, and the business say that that's going to happen? I could probably spend another 20 minutes talking about us versus them cultures. It really irritates me, but I feel like the first step of avoiding this is getting to know your operation. If you're wondering why you can't understand this slide, it's because this is the Nepalese police org chart. But having worked in many big places, this is often how I feel when I'm presented with one. It doesn't really make any sense to me. You'll get asked maybe to talk to these people at the top, and those people are great at giving strategy and setting direction and maybe telling you what the KPIs are. But really, what I would advise you to do is spend your time down here. It's these people who are day in, day out, speaking to your customers, knowing how the actual organization operates and getting stuff done themselves. When I worked at British Gas, I spent a lot of time in their central heatings installation business. They install approximately 100,000 boilers a year. One great thing about British Gas is they really encourage new joiners to go out and spend time with their engineers and contact center agents. But ideally, if you can take this a step further, you want to identify and meet all the different teams along your customer journey and spend some time with them to really understand how they operate. If you're sitting there thinking, oh, but I work in a totally digital organization, digital product, the principle still applies. Go speak to sales teams, go and speak to advertising, speak to customer services or finance. Invest the time to know how it all fits together. In this example, I'm just going to walk you through the journey. So if you wanted a new boiler, you'd call up one contact centre agent. They'd talk to you about what British Gas can offer, and then they would pass you to another agent to actually book your sales appointment. Then a field sales agent will go to your house, and then another agent, if you decided you wanted the quote, to they'll book in your engineer. Your engineer then turns up at your house, installs your boiler, and then you might get a follow-up call after it. That's 6 different teams, all which have different processes and different purposes that you really need to understand. So talking about process, you might find one of these. And process flows are really helpful in understanding what the management might think the process is. But what I've usually found is where there's one of these, there are some of these people. Now, they might not be quite as smiley as this. However, 9 times out of 10, where there's a process, there's a workaround, and it's these people who are doing it. So if you can go and find these people and ask them these questions, you might get to really understand what's going on. Ask them, what do you do? This is more about the business expectation of their role. And it's helpful to just sort of give you a starting point. How do you do it? Understand the systems they're using. This is where I usually find everyone starts showing me how they're copying and pasting against 3 different documents or lots of different systems. And this is where the real fudgy stuff happens. Why do you do it? Now, this is a bit of more of a softer question, and it's one I particularly like because it's about getting to know the person you're talking to. It's easy to go and sit with an operations team and you ask them and show me how you post this job or do this, but actually talk to the person. They're giving up their time for you, and it's great to get to know them if you've been given that privilege. You'll also find that it builds rapport, and then when you're looking for someone's advice or help later on, you've got a contact there already. And lastly, what frustrates you about your role? This is assuming they haven't already poured out all their frustrations to you already at this point. What I would say here is just be careful. It's quite tempting when you understand what someone's frustrations are to want to help, and it's not your job to fix all the problems. But you do need to understand what potential pitfalls you might come up against when releasing product changes into the organization. For example, here, when I worked at Gumtree, I needed to make a change on the e-commerce journey. And it all looked fine up until the point I started talking to someone in the operations team. And they told me that actually they use that e-commerce journey that was supposed to be just for our online customers to actually manage one of our pro accounts, and therefore that the solution I'd come up with wasn't going to work at all. Secondly, know your role. This is one where I sort of implore you to learn from my mistakes. It's so much easier said than done, knowing your role, and perhaps more importantly, where the boundaries of your role lie. But if you do, you can ensure that your energy is focused in exactly where it needs to be. So I've turned up in a couple of organizations to be presented like this. I mean, not the outfit, obviously, but this kind of promise that I'm some sort of superhero and I'm going to solve everybody's problems. And the reason I really messed up once was because I wanted to be this person. It's really admirable to want to change the business and to own those problems and to really drive things forward. But if you're positioned like this, it's a bit of a stitch up. If you want to succeed, you really need to make it clear what you're doing, but also what you're not, and communicate it. If you're in a massive hierarchical organization, you're going to need to keep beating that drum of what you're doing so that you can manage expectations. And if someone misjudges it, call it out in a meeting. I reached an absolute breaking point because I tried to take everything on once. I took it on really personally because I really wanted to transform the business. but it's a slippery slope. And the more time you invest, the more time I found I was losing elsewhere and not achieving anything. As PMs, our job is hard enough. We wear so many hats as it is. You don't need to make it harder. As important as it is to set boundaries, it's more important to do what you say you're going to do. I'm going to say it one more time. Do what you say you're going to do, and then communicate it. It was one of recent product experience podcast, actually, where there was talk about being a great leader and manager is about building trust. And it does build trust, and it also really makes your role clear to others and also signposts your delivery, and it helps your reputation. And in big organizations, your reputation really does precede you. We talk a lot as PMs about saying no. It's key to remain focused on the important stuff, and it's a valuable thing to do. But saying no doesn't mean you should be difficult. Be helpful. There's a fine line between being helpful and being doormat. I do get that. But you can say no and still teach someone how to do something so that they can do it themselves next time, or then go and find the right person, build your network, and then you can redirect stuff to them in future. It builds networks, it builds your reputation, and it keeps momentum. Know your influence. It's another PM classic, right? Influence. We don't have any authority, but we do have influence. It's frequently referenced, but what does it really mean and how do you do it? Well, what I've come to learn is that influence is far less about something you do and more about how you make others feel. So how do you do that? Bring your personality. Now, I'm not saying you need to start cracking jokes or this need to ooze charisma with everyone you talk to, but do try and be yourself. I've read a lot, and there are loads and loads of articles out there about bringing your authentic self to work. And Brené Brown famously talks about the power of vulnerability, and I believe it's true. But think about when you're in the company of someone who's really open and honest with themselves, it really makes you feel good to be around them. And big companies, they're so often these giant grey offices, and it really doesn't matter how many beanbags you throw awkwardly into a meeting room. It's really the people who bring themselves to work that makes it a fun place to be. And if you think about all the people you've really enjoyed working with, I bet it's probably because they're a bit like this. Be memorable. Now, really, the title of this slide is a little bit flippant, but really what I wanted to share was an example of how bringing your personality can have a great impact. So these people you can see on the screen, that's the boiler alert team, the BAT, hence the awkward engineer dressed as Robin. It was at Hive when I was PMing the development of the UK's first smart boiler. It was really, really early days, and we were just trying to get a trial off the ground. The boiler itself that we were developing sent data back to us at Hive, and we developed this app so that if your boiler broke, the app would alert us and we could see what was going on with the boiler. But to then really identify which customer it was, we had to get BG contact center agents to be able to call the customer and tell them that the boiler had broken down. But as I mentioned earlier, there are 2,000 very busy contact center agents at British Gas, and they've all got targets to hit, and they've all got managers who are wanting to make sure they hit their targets. And so they perhaps didn't have time to indulge us wanting to develop a little bit of a novelty boiler. However, because I'd invested a lot of time and spent a lot of time with people in the contact center, and I'd helped them out on a number of occasions, they were also willing to help me out. And it was between us and these exchange of favors that we were able to put this team together. Avoid the backfire effect with your winning personality. I don't know if any of you have heard of the backfire effect before, but if you haven't, it's a cognitive bias that causes people who encounter evidence that challenges their beliefs to reject that evidence. Making. But if you're in a huge organization, which, let's face it, might be a bit hippo-y in how things get decided, data alone might not be enough. It's these relationships and building that rapport that's going to help you smooth things over and trying to be data driven. You can use the knowledge of that person to be empathetic to their position and craft your message slightly differently. And lastly, we spend on average 90,000 hours of our lives at work. It's a long time to not be spending it with your family. Now, I love getting to know new people, and I'm a big extrovert, so that's not really a surprise. And I'm not saying that you have to become best mates with everyone you work with, but being open to building friendships with those people you see every single day, aside from the reason it will help you get shit done, it also just makes coming into work a hell of a lot more enjoyable. And if you're sitting here watching this and thinking, yeah, of course, tell me something I don't know. Well, you'd be surprised. I've worked with a couple of people now who have said to me they weren't interested in building friendships at work because they just came in to get their job done and they wanted to go home. They might have been good PMs, but they encountered huge hurdles because people might not have trusted them or felt they got to know them. So in conclusion, if you're memorable by bringing your personality and you're empathetic to the operation, you've built your network, you do what you're going to say you're going to do, and then tell people you've done it, then you can navigate the sprawling companies with a bit more ease, and we can all travel in the same direction together. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Pippa. Thanks ever so much. And thank you to Matt and to Steve. Great 3 talks. Really appreciate it from everyone. I've been tracking the questions and we have a few. So let's kick off with one of those. And the first one is for everybody. Anybody can answer it, or all of you if you've got different takes. And that's how do you handle internal products differently? Do you handle them differently at all? How do you handle those which are very common within the enterprise? Any takers?
Go on, Steve.
I'll go. I handle internal products in the same way as I would external products. You've got to find your customers and really understand the problems they're encountering, and keep questioning the why you're doing it. I think you can often get suckered into doing stuff that perhaps isn't as important when you're building internal products, because you get swayed by the noise of people. Your stakeholders are also your customers, which can get a bit confusing, but you just need to stay really true to yourself and some key product principles, and that can really help guide you.
I was going to say, I think one of the things, this is a really specific kind of point, but I think one of the things that kind of gets lost quite a lot is often you're outside your comfort zone. You might be talking to the finance team about, how you're going to reconcile, the accounts for the month, and it's quite a technical thing that maybe isn't in your wheelhouse. And it's very easy to kind of think that they've got all the answers and to slip into that mindset of, being handed requirements by the finance team, or by in a way that you would never do when you're talking to an end user, like a customer outside of the organization. So I echo what Pippa said, but I think it's particularly important when you're dealing with kind of quite specialized technical teams who really genuinely believe they know what their requirements are.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Steve and Pippa have already said, really. It's, product management is ultimately about discovering where value is, and how you can satisfy your customer needs while fulfilling the mandate of the business. And to echo Pippa's point, I don't think there is actually much of a difference in a way, except for that your customers are much easier to access than they are when you're building products outside. So yeah, I don't feel like there's a gigantic difference in the way that you approach it, except for that, you know, your internal colleagues who are your customers are going to have a pre-existing view of what you're like. So if you know you've got a reputation going around, for instance, that you're great with ideas but you don't really follow through or something like that, that's going to work against you. So one of the things you would want to do is make sure that you take active control of your reputation, take people out for coffees and so on, get to know people before you start trying to sell into them or establish what requirements they need.
Great, thanks everyone. Another question from YouTube, so please add to the YouTube question to the chat channel if you've got one. I'll read it straight from there. A lot of people feel worried about joining these big orgs and losing their flexibility, their outcomes and their dateless roadmaps. Should they worry? Go for it, someone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to nominate Steve because I spoke first last time.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Dateless roadmaps, yeah, interesting. I think there is a bit of an aspect, and obviously, this is a really kind of contentious issue for product managers, but I think there's a feeling that when you work in a really, really big company, you've made it when you have to put a date on something, because it means you've got downstream expectations from your customers who have dates themselves. And that means you're in a really brilliant position, because it means you've made it. You've got a product which your customers depend on so much that all of their dependencies are based on your product, and that's fantastic. When I worked at Pearson, we had systems that we had systems where we only did one release per year of any size, because there were, for example, exams based on a platform, and if you change that platform during the year, it could change the statistic, the statistical significance of those exams. So we would take the platform down, and I'm sure they don't do this anymore, but we would take the platform down for up to 2 weeks, believe it or not, once per year, to make the changes we needed to have. And we had to do that because we had customers all the way down the track that had dates assigned to us. And I thought it was a privilege that we had that problem, because it meant that that our customers depended on us, and that that's what a date is at the end of the day. It's a dependency that your customer hasn't.
From my point of view, should you feel worried? Well, no, you shouldn't feel worried, but you should feel like you're not going to be able to necessarily always go in there and have full autonomy from day one, because you are fitting into a bigger way of working, and you will sometimes want to be changing that to be better aligned with more progressive product management techniques. But until you've established a credibility within the organization, you may find it difficult to get the leverage that you need to get those practices widely adopted. And what you're going to find quite often is that in large companies, individual product teams are not particularly well modularized from one another. It's like there are dependencies across teams, shared services, and these kinds of things that have been put in place, often for good reason. There's this thing called Chesterton's fence or Chesterton's gate, I can't remember, which is to say that if you come across a fence that doesn't seem to be doing anything, before you remove it, you should understand why it was put there, because fences don't just materialize out of nowhere, and that really applies to large companies. You'll probably walk in with your outcomes and your flexibility and your dateless roadmaps and go, you guys are all idiots, but they may not be idiots, in fact. So you need to sort of size up the system and size up how things are working, and then intentionally decide where you're going to try and make changes, and where you might have leverage to do so. So I think you shouldn't feel worried, because as I alluded to in my talk, your reach is phenomenal for improving things if you can do it at scale. But it's not going to be just about you doing your thing. You're going to have impact by getting everyone else to do your thing, but that will take a bit of time to achieve.
Thanks very much, Matt. We've got another question. When new product ideas are brought to you, how do you challenge them without creating a culture where people don't bring ideas to the fore?
I'll happily talk about that. I think this is really, really good question. It's so important to foster a culture where people can share ideas. And I think going back to what I was saying around saying no, but being helpful, I think one of the parts of that is listening. We have to sort of pause our egos for a while. It's really easy because sometimes we can get a little bit lost in our power of PMs, of saying no, to actually stop and listen to what people have to say. Give people a bit of your time, because it might be they're coming with the solution, but it's that classic thing. If they're coming with a solution, it's because they're fixing their own problem in their mind, and you want to take a bit of time to understand the problem. So if you can give the time yourself, but then also find ways or forums for people to share those ideas, it's okay if they're not picked up and carried forward, because people can see that you listen and that you're prepared to be helpful. That would be my advice.
I think it's a tricky one from my point of view, because so we talk about hypothesis-driven development, for instance, and that's something that I certainly practice within my team. We have different value hypotheses around the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, different ideas for achieving that value and validating those hypotheses. But ultimately, someone's got to decide which hypotheses you pursue, right? And I don't think that ought to be the product manager in isolation. Of course, you have your other important stakeholders on the team, like the lead engineer or the senior designer, or your marketer, if that's important to you, or your salesperson, whatever. But ultimately, there's got to be a single ringable neck who is accountable and responsible for deciding which hypotheses you pursue. So that's your job. Actually, that's on you as the product manager in the end. So I think the thing to do is to try to build an environment where openness is encouraged, where transparency is the norm, and make sure that the team knows in the end that you fight for them and that you have their back and that you respect their views. I think these are the basic nourishing elements of a good team that you need to try to put in place in every team. And if you do that, then you'll find that people will be okay with challenge, because you'll have established the basis of trust in the first place.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that really briefly, which is that I think actually it might have been on Dave's blog. I might be wrong. He made a point about backlogs becoming kind of like a graveyard for everything that anyone suggested, and the easiest thing to do is to kind of just shove it on the, it's the classic phrase, oh yeah, I'll put it on the backlog, and it's kind of a way of batting away things that are never going to happen. And they, after about 3 years, you end up going into GitHub and deleting God knows how many things that have been hanging around for years that because you were too polite to have the conversation up front. I think there is an element where kind of making people, a bit like I do with my kids, making people reach their own conclusions about whether or not it's a good idea is a really good strategy. So point back to the overall strategy for the business and the initiatives you've got kind of on the books at the moment, and say, look, what would you do? Where would you put this? Do you think this is more or less important? Or is it something maybe we should do? And quite often people reach their own conclusion that actually they have got a great idea. They've got a great, wouldn't it be great if, but it's not as great as the ones that are already being focused on.
That's a great answer. Thanks, everybody. I think we have time for one last question, and it's probably a nice one to end on. And that's, as hiring managers and product leaders in the large companies you work for, what advice could you give what do you look for, and what advice could you give to somebody looking to get into product who has little experience in that sector?
Sorry, is the question, if you got a little experience in product, how would you advise getting into product?
Yes.
It's a good question.
I'm happy to. Yeah, I'm happy to take it. I actually love getting people to get into product from other parts of the business, because I think if you've spent time working at any other part of any business operation, you're going to have some really rich knowledge that someone who's just stayed in product the whole time might not actually think about. So firstly, as more and more bigger companies do start moving to cross-functional squads, see if you can get in from a different part of the business to even just attend a couple of stand-ups, or see if you can offer some of your subject matter expertise in a different business function to help an existing product squad. And it might not be as you sort of step in first off as a product manager, but just get you into the rhythm of seeing what they're doing. I'd also find a mentor or a coach who also is willing to just invest a bit of time. I always find that people are willing to help because they've been helped along the way. I certainly really love investing my time in other people, because I've been so privileged to have been helped by others. There's also so many great tools online, like Medium articles. I listen to the Product Experience podcast and just seek out, just keep using these sorts of meetups to expand your network, and don't be afraid to put your hand up. That would be my advice.
I'll be very brief because I think we're pretty much out of time, but my only addition to both of those excellent kind of comments would be a product manager. So basically, no matter what role you're in, you can bring product thinking to it, and you can create your own case study. If you're in finance, you can still come up with a product thinking around a transformation that you're doing within finance. If whatever job you're doing, customer services, operations, whatever it is, build your case study yourself. And then when you go into an interview, you've actually got something to talk about, rather than going in an interview and talking about what you could do. You can just say, well, here's an example of when I did it and I wasn't even a product manager. Imagine what I could do if I was a product manager. And if I saw someone coming to an interview and saying that to me, I'd be biting their hand off.
That's great advice. Thanks everybody. Thanks again to all the speakers. Thanks again to Mind the Product. Thanks again to Mixpanel. And thankfully Zoom and YouTube have helped us out today to make sure this went ahead. So that's it for today. It's a wrap. So just to close it off, and thank everybody for joining and listening. So hopefully next time we'll be in person. Who knows? Bye everyone.
Cheers everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.